All right, so it has been a very full day. I'm grateful to you all for staying. Dr. Curry gave us a lot of information, and what we're going to do now is just kind of unpack that information in a way that's more conversational. So we're going to give you an opportunity to ask questions as well as we process this. So first, Dr. Curry, again, thank you for coming here all the way from Scotland, right?
Yes, yes. Cold, lonely Scotland.
To cold, lonely Montgomery County. Okay. Can you tell us where you're from?
Originally from Lake Charles, Louisiana. So I
okay.
spent a good part of my life, actually basically just in Lake Charles, but I was pretty young because I was a high school debater. I got to travel to different college campuses like Emory, University of Missouri, Kansas City, and that kind of opened me up to college and wanted to be a professor. So I decided I wanted to be a professor probably around 13 or 14.
Oh, my gosh.
And I kind of pursued that, given some of my interest in critical race theory and critical legal studies when I was in high school. So,
When did you graduate from high school?
Jesus, so long ago now. 1997. But yeah, I know I'm old. But you know, it's funny because my parents just came to Scotland for the first time to see their grandchildren, and we had this conversation because when I was in high school, my parents and I had a real argument because I was done with high school. I wanted to leave in like 95, 96. Like I finished everything, and they made me stay in high school. So where I'm from, Louisiana, in Lake Charles, it's very difficult for black people to really gain anything. Everything in Lake Charles is still controlled by whites. The city is super segregated. I didn't see there were no black professors even at the local college that I knew of in McNeese. So I wanted to leave there ASAP. But my parents made me stay another year, so I didn't get to leave till I was 17. And that issue came up again when they came to visit. Like it wasn't bitter, but it was still that kind of like, that kind of thing. And it's funny because, when you go to Lake Charles, and I mean this happens to me even now, when you go to Lake Charles, there's this overwhelming sense of the racism because it's old school race, it's a segregationist Southern racism, and you see so many black people living their life and doing well in their life, but still ruled and managed by white people. So, I think that experience of seeing white people manage black people, control their life, control where they live, control how they work, really impacted how I see racism and how I study racism now.
So your family, are they all from the same place?
Well, my dad's from up north, so he's from Jonesboro. Deacons, that kind of thing. Real country place, 2 stops. They still eat squirrel out there. But my mom's from Lake Charles, so he met her when his family moved to Lake Charles, and they happened to go to the same high school. So,
And you're married with children.
I am.
What are your children's ages?
So my baby is 12, and my oldest is 14. I have 2 little girls.
And where have they been raised primarily?
Oh, God, that's a good question. Well, I mean, we've been in Scotland for about 5 years now, so I mean, for my baby, I get almost half her life's been in Europe. But my oldest, she has a much stronger memory of the United States. And it's funny because you can tell by their accents. Like my oldest sounds like a mix of Alabama and Texas for some reason. And my youngest is a very kind of international schoolish accent, like a very strong American accent, picks up kind of Scottish slang. So it's kind of strange.
Wow, that is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your background. One thing that kind of hit me today was you speaking on, and I've heard the word, but you eloquently demonstrated what dehumanization looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And how can you humanize something you don't even see as being human? How can you ever battle those types of constructs and characterizations? So tell us some of the negative characterizations that show up for black men. What do those things look like?
Well, that's a really good question because it changes based on the context and the era you're speaking about. So during the 19th century, the major depiction of black men were as savages. So in 1854, you even have Frederick Douglass giving addresses to the ethnological societies, explaining the difference between the black person or the Negro as man versus beast. Now, that distinction is really important because you have to remember in the 19th century, the dominant way of studying black people was through ethnological sciences, which was ironically founded in the Anglo-speaking world at the University of Edinburgh, where I teach. So the first introduction to the idea of racial hierarchy was based in how you had people like Douglas Stewart actually looking at debates between, Andrew Jackson and Sam Stanhope Smith, debating about whether or not black people were human beings, debating about whether or not they were intelligent, whether they were lazy. Their theory at the time was that as black people made more contact with white people, their phenotype would lighten and they would become more intelligent and civilized. So it's important to understand that when these ideas were first formulated, our dark skin was indicative of the kind of interior moral and intellectual qualities we had. So for white societies in Europe, they thought that, well, it's not just enough to relocate black people to European societies. We had to also change their complexion, and the lightening of their complexion would be a reflection of the evolution of their moral and intellectual qualities.
I'm sorry, mixing was intentional.
I'm sorry?
Mixing was intentional, is that what you're saying?
Well, no, they didn't think that it would happen because of race mixing. They
Okay.
thought that of the mere contact of black people and white people together would actually lighten their skin tone. Now, if you're looking at how some European countries thought of it, they actually did think that amalgamation or racial mixture was the way to improve racial stocks. But that usually wasn't an Anglo-Saxon or British system. You see that more with the Portuguese or with Spanish people, those types of things.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, different ethnicities had different racial taxonomies and understood the process of colonization differently, which is why it's really important for us to have a very specific and contextual notion of the specific disease and pathology of the European we're dealing with, right? British taxonomies are not going to be the same as Spanish or Portuguese taxonomies, right? So we have to, but the one thing that's very clear throughout all that is that you start with a base of black inferiority that's linked to savagery and bestiality. And then white people, whether or not they're German or whether or not they're Toots or Anglo-Saxons, et cetera, stand above us. In this system, the metric for how we judge racial inferiority were men. So one of the big things that black male studies scholars focus on, at least in our historiography, is how we articulate racial difference through the accumulation of racial traits on male or fraternal or paternal genealogies.
So my innate self says if something is not human, it's not like you.
Yes.
And that means it's not valuable.
Mm-hmm.
There is a certain level of value that's assigned to every member of society. And it almost sounds like there is little to no value for a black man.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So what can we do? Is it possible to humanize black boys and men? Is it possible? And if so, how?
Well, I think, when we ask those questions, I'm always very specific about which culture we're trying to address. Within the white world view, right, the dominant Eurocentric mode throughout the West, you're not going to find value in blackness because it's the antithesis of how they define whiteness. So we see this all the way back, from the Enlightenment forward at the very least. When we're talking about black people, it becomes so important that our worldview and our values align with the demonstrated humanity, resistance, and revolt that we've had against those ideas of dehumanization. We have to remember that dehumanization is not just thinking of someone as not human. It's the position by which you're not human and should be ruled or eliminated by that which is human. So that's why when you look at genocides or you're looking at colonial, conquests or impositions, you're looking at people being eliminated from the face of the land. That's because the existence of the native people or the indigenous people stands in complete contrast to that of the civilized nation. So in other words, part of the process of enslavement, part of the process of imperialism and colonization is to rid these groups of people from parts of the land that white people want to own, conquer, exploit, whatever the case may be. And that's why I say that because what we've done in the United States is define racism based on what we think we should get and deserve in the U.S. So we've looked at racism as a form of discrimination that prevents equality or living like white people. We have de-emphasized the impact that racism's had historically, which is to eliminate and justify people non-existing. And because we're looking at such machinations of death and destruction now, right? Where it's just in our face, where we're facing another election of Trump. You have people having to drop this veneer that racism is primarily about discrimination. So this issue of dehumanization is coming to be brought back into forefront, because now we have to ask ourselves, well, God, if equality is not possible in the United States, what has actually been happening to our people? We've been thinking we're suffering and dying because we're trying to be equal, that one day that battle will be won for us. But when we no longer have that delusion, right, this delusion that we can be equal within a land that keeps taking our rights away and takes any kind of progress as an offense to its very culture and civilization, now you're looking at, well, what other resources do we have to explain this? Like, why are black people being oppressed? Why are black men being killed? Why are black boys being fundamentally removed from classrooms and young black boys being removed from society? That requires a different analysis and a different set of conceptual tools that I think we can see a lot of black liberals aren't even ready to deal with yet, because they've built themselves on the myth of an elevation based on economic and education, on economic class position and education that's not translated into political power, right? And so the dehumanized black male stands outside of how these middle class and kind of the academic bourgeois want to see themselves. You thought you left that back in Jim Crow, right? So the poor black male that's experiencing police brutality, incarceration, social stigma and ostracization, that's a reminder that in the 21st century, you still have the legacy of Jim Crow segregation, on your very shores next to your house. But you don't want to deal with that population because it reminds you of the kind of harsh legacies of racism that still go pretty well with American democracy.
So it's the reminder that
Absolutely.
that we're not comfortable with as black people.
Absolutely, because remember, the narrative that you're getting, I mean, we see this even in the election, the narrative that you're getting is that there are certain groups of black people who are educated, are black and female, that support the Democratic Party platform. These other black people that are poor, that are destitute, that are uneducated, right, that are criminal, deviant, et cetera, well, those are the black people that we need to deal with. So we don't need to listen to them. We don't need to value them. And this is how dehumanization coexists so neatly with contemporary, right, liberalism and democratic politics. We say we're going to reward black people, but we're very clear that it's a very specific group of black people that we want to pull up. And these other black people who are largely poor black men, we're afraid of, so they can't come along for the journey, right? And that's how dehumanization exists. We allow those black men to be talked about in ways that they're savage, where they're primarily driven by sex, money, power, violence, etc., when that's not the case for poor black men at all. We allow these dominating and controlling myths about them to capture our attention, and we use that to explain political realities. Instead of saying, well, maybe the pessimism of these groups of black men is they see that Democratic Party politics, Democratic platforms, that white liberalism don't exactly improve the conditions of black people in the United States overall, and they're willing to call that out. So dehumanization works side by side, not only with political recognition, but the people that we think we can sacrifice in the name of moving a group of black people forward and above others.
Wow. Ooh, boy, that's a lot. I don't even know how to quite process all of it, because I've heard it, but I didn't quite picture it until you came in today. I'm going to use that as a segue to talk about something which is what led to us being here.
Sure.
And that was the high rate of suicide in Montgomery County. We have the highest rate of suicide in the state, but not having the highest population of black folks, right? And one thing that we don't acknowledge, because we're not human, is the trauma that does happen to our black boys and men. It's not acknowledged, or it's even laughed about. I think, one thing that I've seen time and time again, and I specifically work on economic justice, right? I've seen that the black boys and men that have the least are ridiculed, but also they're subject to a lot of trauma. What do you think about that in this grand scheme of humanization?
Well, I think a few things are at play there. As much as we talk about rethinking masculinity and rethinking the position that men and boys, black men and boys, have in our communities, we still confine them to this notion of provider and economic security. So part of being a man for black people does revolve around the idea that black men can still provide security even when they face the incredible odds of racism and racial discrimination in employment. So when black men don't live up to that kind of historical standard, rather than us adjusting our cultural frame to say, look, there are reasons why black men aren't provided with these opportunities that white men traditionally have, we ridicule them for not being real men, right? And we see, and this is part of, when someone mentioned the gender war earlier, this is what we see hashing out on social media. Well, black men are broke, black men are dusty, black men are trash, black men, X, Y, and Z. But at the same time, those very same people that say that are talking about, well, black men buying the patriarchy. But the standard you're using to evaluate black men next to white men is patriarchy, right? The reason that white men have resources disproportionately compared to black men is because of unjust enrichment, slavery, Jim Crow, economic discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the responsibility that falls on black people is to redefine those roles and to understand what they are, right? And the reason this relates so heavily to humanizing black men is because you're questioning the Eurocentric standard of what a man is. See, if you define manhood on the basis of endurance, resilience, revolt, right, care for community, then black men jump over that standard, because black men in every period of history, right, we're talking about from the 1700s to the present, have been willing to sacrifice their lives for the betterment of their whole group. And we don't often talk about that. See, we frame black men in such a way that we say that the black men who were leaders in the civil rights movement got all the attention and did it for power. But those notions don't come from black people. Those notions come from white feminists that were looking at the black movement and were threatened by the potential and the speed of which black men were threatening to gain political power. So they turned that notion of civil rights into, oh, they want to dominate women, right? This is Shulamith the Firestone. So when you have that kind of conversation, you no longer see black men dying for the whole of the group. You see black men now dying for power over other group members, right? Like women, children, et cetera. So we need to be careful about how we're interpreting that history and where those kinds of interpretations and paradigms come from, right? If we redefine black manhood on the basis of struggle against oppression, if we define black manhood on willingness to be involved and be good fathers, right? Or build up communities, or fight against evilness in the world, then black men have a very strong and historically salient version of manhood that we could all learn from. But if you're trying to compare them to kind of the toxicity of the white patriarch, right? And when I say the white patriarch and white patriarchy, I'm talking about that kinship system between white men and white women. If you're looking at that system as the model for how black families or black middle class families should exist, then you're always going to pathologize black families. You're always going to pathologize black relationships. You're always going to look upon black people as if black love is lesser.
So what you compare it to matters.
Oh, absolutely.
So we
absolutely.
can't compare it to the European standard, because it just that's not who we are.
And and back in the 60s and 70s, when there was black family studies and the concentration on the black family, this is something that was very clear to us. But after integration and the rise of kind of a gender analytic, that became lost in the idea that we actually have a competition between the political excess of black men and the political resources that were being given to black women. Those notions splintered us, and it skewed the way that we're actually able to look at the black family, black community, black neighborhoods, and black uplift from a more objective and scientific and culturally relevant perspective.
Let's circle back again to the trauma of black males. I know that we do not talk about abuse, and I think you brought it up today.
Yes.
I'm encountering more and more black men who are coming forward saying they've been molested by women. I met a man in a store once that detailed how his mother would hurt him and hit him after his father left. And that's something that continues to be under-acknowledged. And if we don't talk about it, we can't do anything about it. Where does that leave our men with those types of traumas?
Well, usually it leaves us silent and untreated, to be quite honest with you. There's not a place for us to actively discuss the child physical and sexual abuse that we experience in our own communities. And I say that because you have a real backlash. I don't think I'm exaggerating here. You have a real backlash from black academics in the United States who are unwilling to either listen to the narratives of young black boys, whether it's revealed in qualitative studies or even in rap music, right? Or these kind of public displays and stories and experiences. And you have a complete rejection of data. So what we have in the United States is a very clear narrative within the academy. That narrative says that the only people who could be victims of sexual abuse are women. And when you bring up the fact that black men and boys have the earliest age of sexual debut, right, between 12 and 14 and 9 and 12, those are the two biggest kind of cohorts for early sexual debut among black boys. When you look at the fact that many black boys don't trust their first sexual experiences because it's been clouded by kind of adultification and expectation. This is what they should do, often by older peers or caretakers. You don't have the freedom to say, hey, these boys are being victimized. And I think one of the most controversial pieces that I've had to deal with doing this kind of work is trying to make people understand that you could hurt black boys because they're children. That's been a real contention, I think, with other black academics across the United States, because you're holding on to an ideological myth. You're holding on so tight to the story that there can only be one victim, and that one victim of sexual abuse in our communities has to be black women and girls. And that's just not the reality. No one would ever deny that black women and girls suffer from early sexual debut, statutory rape, et cetera. We know that, but the same data sets that show that also show that black boys have many of those same experiences. But yet we don't want to acknowledge that because the frameworks we use say that black boys have to be perpetrators. They have to be hypersexual. They have to be lusting after, right?
They can't be victimized
They can't
sexually.
be victimized, right? So we push them into this perpetrator role, and we say that anything that questions that they're perpetrators is trying to make an apology for violence, right? And the reality of the situation is that our communities, our lives are much more complex than that, and that means that these black men are working through and living with unresolved trauma and hurt, injury that's happened to them both at the spiritual and mental level. And they take that with them. So when we see things like intimate partner violence, we see things like depression, when we see marriages breaking up, we see child abuse, et cetera, we're seeing the remnants of that past enact itself in their daily lives. And that's an issue where we much rather frame black men as pathological perpetrators of violence and look at them as victims of violence that are reenacting and some certain kinds of practices that were enacted upon them. You, in order to humanize black men, you have to recognize vulnerability. There's no two ways about it. If you view black men as savage beasts that are only there to harm, who seek to injure other people for lust and power, then you're never going to get to the humanity that's behind what you think that reality represents. And far too many scholars, far too many people that are making policy and write for our opinion makers see black men in that light. They see black men as these creatures of habit and disaster that impose this on other people in our own communities, instead of saying, well, look, what happened to that black man?
That's right.
You know, I had a colleague, she told me, you're different, you're not, when you study black men, when I read your work, it's not the same. And I was like, well, that's because I don't fear black men. Like when I look at black men, and if I read a news article that says a black man did X, I'm going to say, well, what happened to him?
Right.
Right? Like the question is, what happened to it? What was the injury or antecedent event that created the negative outcome?
Right.
Because we know the prevalence of domestic abuse in homes. We know the prevalence of child sexual abuse, sexual coercion in black homes. If we say, well, he's the perpetrator and that's the end of the story, well, then that stops me from saying, well, what happened to him as a child? What was the relationship with his mother or father? What kind of neighborhood did he live in? Was he exposed to early violence, right? There's a whole life course there, right, that needs to be examined. And that's not what we're doing. We're short-circuiting it because we're using stereotypes to fill in for actual analysis.
That's right. Who here is a Montgomery County native? Anyone here Montgomery County native? Okay, you might be young. I'm not sure. Were you here during the time of the D.C. sniper? Okay. Now, wait a minute. How everybody started raising their hands? Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So there was recently a post on Instagram saying that Montgomery County was attempting to either vacate the charges of Malvo. Malvo at the time was 16, and he was convinced by his father figure to go on this killing spree. And the killing spree was so that he could actually kill his ex-wife and make it look like it was random, right? And I actually commented on that post, and I don't get into social media fights. I'm barely on social media. And my post stated that this was literally a psychologically abused and brainwashed child. And if you changed his gender and his skin color, the comments I'm seeing here wouldn't even exist. Now, I didn't argue freedom. I didn't argue to keep him or to keep him free. I simply stated this was a vulnerable young man. And the backlash I got, well, I don't care anything about that. But it's just shocking because I know if that were a victim of trafficking that were a little white girl, or a victim of domestic violence that was a white woman, those comments would have been different. Shed some light on that.
Well, I mean, I think this is exactly what we see in the literature, right? That there's no compassion for black men and boys, no matter what their circumstances are. They're already designed in the minds of whites to be killers and to be deviants. So vulnerability matters because it suggests to us that there can be an action or event that changes the course, behaviors, or patterns of one's thinking or consciousness or the way they act in the world, right? So if I'm vulnerable to something and something bad happens to me, my actions and the way of perceiving the world have fundamentally been contoured and changed. What we see with the case of black boys is there's a fixity that no matter what disadvantages they suffer, no matter what harm has been done to them, the behaviors, actions, and thoughts are going to be the same. And that's part of the pathology that's built into the very bones of anti-black misandry, that other people have choices they could develop, right? This is what I meant earlier when I said that when you're looking at anti-black misandry, it's really a problem of ontogeny. It's a problem of how we conceptualize the development of an organism, or in this case, a human being, from baby to adult. Black boys and black men are thought to have the same evolutionary trajectory.
And as I think about this, why was Patty Hearst allowed to have Stockholm Syndrome?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Because the idea was there's something that intervened that changes the behavior such that that's not what a rational or moral person, in quotes, would do. With a black boy, he's never rational or moral. So anything that's expressed by him is going to be part of his nature. It wasn't adjusted by the disadvantages he suffered. And this is a very dangerous trope that justifies both the removal and the elimination of black boys from society. If you don't believe that black boys can change, then they'll get the harshest punishments available because you're punishing their activity and you're trying to protect others from them, right? So this is why when we talk about anti-black misandry, we're talking about not only the stereotypes that are used to express excess savagery, right? Hypersexualization, hypermasculinity, et cetera, but the ways in which those kinds of ideas rationalize the need to remove those people from society and in contact with other people. So that's why you see juvenile incarceration, the mass incarceration system, lethal violence used against black males to such an extent. Because the idea is in order to protect society, they have to either be locked away or they have to die. And that rationalization has been picked up across the board. So of course, right, Malvo is not going to have the sympathies of many people, including especially liberal whites, because the idea is like, look, he's fulfilling his very nature. He's a danger. It's not, the brainwashing didn't matter. That's what he would do regardless. And that bias exists so much that we don't see a way to kind of correct behavior. We accept it as part of the story of black deviance and black male criminality.
What we're going to do now is we're going to take an opportunity to have input from you all. I know you had a comment in the back, I believe. We're going to take this time for you to express some things that you may want to share. Anyone want to speak at this moment?
I can stay right here. Hi. First
Hello.
of all, thank you. This has been one of the most mind-opening convening that I have been to, and I've been to many this year. And this I will be talking about from now until the next time you do one. But two things. First of all, I was in Montgomery County Detention Center along with Malvo and his the one that they executed, John Muhammad. And at that time, there was no sympathy given this young man. There was no compassion, no empathy, not anything. Not just from white people, but from us. From us. Yes, he should have known better. He should have left when he seen the first time and something happened, blah, blah, blah. We had an excuse for everything, reason why. And I say that to say that what you taught me today was that my understanding and my feelings are valid. That I know that it's not my young son, my nephew, it's not my grandson, it's not none of my 5 boys, that this is not who they are, and I'm not going to continue to sit back and let people portray them as that or tell me that that's who they are and not allow me to sympathize or empathize, more so than sympathize, empathize with what they're going through right now. Right now, I come from Baltimore. Last week, we picketed Fox News. Fox News has a tendency to villainize our young black men in Baltimore. We're trying to make sure that the good We Are Us program, the programs that are in Baltimore, that Fox News, come on, we're going to bring these programs. Tell us about what's going on with them. Show them on our news. You're not going to continue to show our black young men as deviants, as criminals, as carjackers, as anything that you want to claim they are. You know. And the second thing I'd like to say, in line with what you just said about dehumanizing, they just executed a man who clearly everybody thought deserved another didn't say free, but deserved another opportunity to present his case. It didn't matter. It didn't matter at all. You know, they still executed that man. So as we get knowledgeable about what you're telling us now, as we get knowledgeable, as each of us gets knowledgeable, please, let's go back. I have a grandson that's living with me. He works for Amazon. What's going on there is so outrageous. That's a whole nother story. But anyway, I just told him, you know, I hope this is recorded, because me and him are going to sit back and listen to it and talk over it as we do a lot of things. And that's what we're going to have to do. When we hear stuff like this, we're going to have to take it back to our young boys. Take it back to our kids. Make sure that they hear it and that they tell another young brother. And that's the only way we're going to get it. It's just one-on-one, each one teach one. We got to go back to that concept, because the news is not going to do it for us. The media is not going to do it for us. So we're going to have to do it for ourselves. So I'm glad to see everybody here, and I'm so glad to see Baltimore represented over here today.
I thank you for coming all the way from Baltimore. My son went to a program in Baltimore all summer. I've never been to Baltimore really except to go to the airport. I'm not from here. We drove from Montgomery County, Maryland to Baltimore every day. They are doing the best work in Baltimore, and I just have to give a shout out to Baltimore Brothers, to all those orgs there. They are doing the best work, but they will convince you that Baltimore is the worst of the worst. But they are doing the best work in Baltimore. They have the models, and we're going to highlight most of those models tomorrow. So thank you.
Sir, thank you so much once again. You are a mobile university, a wealth of knowledge, an extension of wisdom. And a lot of what you've been able to articulate is not just as a result of being a student of academia, but you have walked the talk. Sort of like an observation, a question, but your articulation in the last few minutes has made me realize, not just now, but it's just reoccurred to me, that there needs to be a rising up of an academic, practical institution of education that is practical at the grassroots level of our society. I always tell people, It is wonderful to sit in forums like this, listen to the genius that has been expounded to us. But it's the responsibility of the community, not only just to take heed, but to become practical in your application. My observation is very simple. It's clear to me that we need to rise up as a community and as a people. They instilled fear into us at the time of the Black Wall Street, and that demon is still running around. Mm-hmm. There's only one person that can quench that demon, and that is ourselves. We need to rise up again and become the powerhouse that we are. I tell people wherever I go in the world, there's a song that came out, I think it's the 70s or the 80s, we built this city. The truth is, we've built this world on the hard-breaking sweat of black intelligentsia, strength, and savvy. And 9 times out of 10, in fact, all the time, it was done in slavery to a people that didn't appreciate us. Yeah. I hear you saying there's a return back. And I stand with you in that understanding. That it is a time for us to rise up. I may sound political, but I'm also saying to you, sir, I perceive that upon your life there is a calling to rise up, not just only in academia. I listen very clearly to you as you articulate the legal aspects of and dynamics of things that need to be addressed. Please continue in your endeavors to enrich our community and empower them. Not just only in the United States, but I see you doing a worldwide and a global transition to empower our people in the diaspora to become one again. I can only tell you this much, and I'm going to end here. The architecture that's been endowed within you, you've had dreams and you've had visions of how am I going to spread it. It is through your multiplication, as you're doing now, of yourself into the lives of other people that are there. Am I speaking somewhat prophetically? Yes, I am. But it is an encouragement to let you know that the task before you is not impossible, because you conquered the impossibility just by transitioning to where you are today. You sit in Europe speaking to a people who marvel at what you say. But you're back home here instilling and stoking up the fire to become an inferno. I thank you for that. God bless you.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Kerr, you have any comment to that?
I mean, I'm incredibly humbled by the comment. I think, you know, I think one of the things that we have to realize is that the knowledge that we have seeks to clarify a position for African descendant people around the world. And one thing that I'm constantly frustrated by, especially when I come to the United States and argue with scholars from the United States, is the view that knowledge enacts a kind of social mobility. Because when you leave the United States, the conversations that you have about blackness here doesn't translate. So if you're talking about colonial exploitation, or you're talking about the situation in the Caribbean, where you have black institutions, black universities, et cetera, still instilling white supremacist norms within black populations by black teachers, the language of anti-blackness and whiteness doesn't translate to that situation. So what I've learned over the last 5 years is that context is especially important. But what we have not done, and this is black people around the world, is whereas white people have the power and luxury to motivate knowledge so that their society is engineered by what they learn and what they produce. So for example, white people have been experimenting with AI for quite some time. And while everyone's been saying it's dangerous, that is now designing and changing the foundational way that data is processed, right? Predictive logic's handled, and people are being trained. We can make criticisms all day about how we feel, but their knowledge translates into different societal outcomes and infrastructure to support their discoveries. What we do is we say that things that are too radical that we discover about the way that systems operate should not interrupt the way that we benefit or wish to benefit from the relative comfort we have in society. So while we now know that hierarchies rebuild themselves and can't be easily shaken, and despite moral persuasion and contact theory, white people's minds don't change, we don't look at those discoveries within knowledge as ways to build new programs or new understandings or change our practices and beliefs about the way the societies are being engineered. So there's a gap between what we think black people know and then the distance that knowledge that black people or black scholars produce travel within our own communities. Regardless of what we discover, it's going to be the people in power who continue to design the infrastructure and dictate the course of these societies. We develop criticisms of that. We take the criticism and then the person dies and the criticism never turns into anything. And one of the things that I really hope happens to black male studies long after I'm gone is that we understand that it's a perspective that explains social phenomena and can predict how social hierarchies are going to be built. If you fundamentally locate racial animus within the males of a specific group, then that tells you that new institutions, logics, and technologies like AI are going to be utilized to perpetuate the same outcomes. So face recognition, predictive logic, deduction, etc., are going to be utilized to enhance the hierarchies you have currently. If we don't learn from that, we're going to be stuck in a data-driven society where we no longer speak the language or can anticipate the next moves of the people that direct government policy and outcomes. And that's the fear I have, because what you have in the United States is an overwhelming sensibility among black intellectuals that we should go into this kind of black speculative metaphysics about what blackness is or wakeness is or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Pick your poison. And we're having metaphysical discussions in a world where policies, militaries, weapons, and data are driving white decisions. And what I'm suggesting is that if we follow the data, we can utilize scientific methods, data, right, and technology, et cetera, to talk about how our people could be better helped and enhanced, right? So I appreciate the comment, but it's one of those things where as much as I think we're developing ideas and doing concrete work, there's a literacy and a connection that we have to make in our knowledge gaps as black people to keep up with how fast technology and knowledge production is actually moving in the world today. But thank you. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello, sir.
I talk.
Please.
Thank you for being here. Okay, 10-4. How you doing? So my name is Harold Hill. I have quite a few articles written up on me in Washington Post as well. If you look up Google Harold Peanut Hill, you'll see a front page article on me based on from a child to where I am today. Today I work in the community. I serve the community in East County, and I deal with a lot of our people, and Spanish, other things. I'm pivoting off of her conversation with Malcolm. When I was young, my mom's had me at 3 years old. I'm sorry, at 15 years old, and she had me at she got pregnant with me at 15 years old and had me at 16 years old. At 3 months, her mom's put her out, and when her mom's put her out, she had no place to really go. So she took me to a lady that she didn't even know, that she met through her school, and gave me to this lady. And this lady raised me in a very, very violent neighborhood, 6th National, D.C., Washington, D.C. As I raised up in this neighborhood, I took on and adapted to the neighborhood. 9 years old, sold drugs, got locked up, started idolizing people in the neighborhood, people that I considered like family, that I trusted, I believed in. I was a kid, you know. They would have me doing things that as a 9-year, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old person, kid, should not even be doing. Not even thinking of doing. Went to prison at 18 years old for murder. My mind didn't even concept what I did, how other people felt. None of that. None of that. Went to prison, adapted to that environment. For survival. Stabbings, fights. Oh, by the way, at 16 years old, I was a 1986 House of Champions in D.C. Could fight. Very good with my hands. Went in prison, served time from the 80s, from 86 all the way to 95. Came home, no education. None. Tried to get a job, didn't have no foundation. Where else I'm gonna go? Back to what I know. Went back to prison again in 2000. When I went back to prison in 2000, something clicked in my head and said, I can't keep doing this. I had to start learning how to learn what was right, starting with the law, starting with how society functions, things of that nature. And as I was helping myself, it made me have compassion about what I did in the past. Now, I want to ask each and every last one of you, can you think of a toy that you played with when you were young, at any age? Can you think of a toy that was your favorite toy that you liked to play with, and you played with this toy every day? Now I'm going to ask you, do you still play with that toy? When I went to my appeal for my charge, I tried to let them know that just because what I did when I was young doesn't mean I'm going to do that now that I'm in my 40s. That's how I look at Lee Malvo. Because we age, as we age, we don't think like we think when we was a child. Even the Bible says. You know what I'm saying? Why are you locking a child up and giving him time as an adult? When he reached that age, that doesn't mean that he's going to do the same mistake. You know what I mean? So my thing is that in the aspect of my changing in life to where I am today, I had to rethink who I am and be positive. And that changed me into having compassion for the things that I did in the past. And also changed me into pulling up the young men that I see today. We must, as black people, stay positive. We can't allow our conditions or what's happening around us to make us be negative. We have to stay positive even in our highest and even in our worst conditions. And I want to know, what do you think about it?
I thank you so much, Harold, for sharing. Thank you.
I mean, first, it's a very powerful story. Let's start there. We have to recognize the potential for change, and in recognizing the potential for change, that's where positivity, that's where understanding our condition, that's what makes a difference. In my mind, I see two things really happening. The idea that black people can't change and be different, than how white people insist they are, and then the fundamental belief that black people have and the stake they have in changing and building a society, the world, communities based on their own vision. I think one of the most disadvantageous things that's ever happened to black people is that we've somehow convinced ourselves that the world before us is not something that we construct. We often see ourselves, because of conditions and because of racism, as powerless to change the circumstances or think differently or be treated differently, right? I think that's the most important, because we don't see the benefits of being different given the way that the white world treats us. But the mistake that we have in doing those kinds of things is exactly what you're talking about. It surrenders our minds and our bodies to systems that never designed for us to live in. And what we've done, and to me, this is the most dishonest part about it. We've pretended that a small group of black people who exist in white institutions, be it academic or government-based, somehow reflect the progress of the people. That's why we had the narrative of black progress under Obama, despite overwhelming sensibilities and evidence of black disadvantage and increasing black suffering. So for us to cope with our reality, what we've often done is we've created disjunction between the material reality of the group and the exceptional black people we wish represented the group. And what I hear in your story is exactly this process by which you have the choice to internalize the conditions as if they have made you and there's no other choice, or the choice to say these conditions are not defining me, I can choose to do something else and define myself based on positive messages. But we have to be specific and careful, because your story represents a success. The question is, how do we build an infrastructure that does that same kind of work, right? White people have the power to produce the kind of people they want. This is why the Republican Party is challenging the curricula at universities throughout the country. The issue is not because they disagree. The issue is because U.S. colleges and universities are producing a white population that cannot sustain the logics of an almost exclusive white republic. If I want a white republic, I have to produce people that don't feel bad about whiteness. How do I do that? I have to scrub this kind of liberal, leftist, multicultural rhetoric around white privilege and about colonialism, et cetera, out of the curriculum, which is why you get them banning things. Notice the ideological sentiment is meant to produce a specific population. We don't do that. And that's what I'm saying is the problem. Our knowledge doesn't produce the kind of people we want to see in the world. And we have to revisit why that's happened. So ultimately, I think you're right. I would just say, given what we've heard today, that our problem is about creating the infrastructure and linking knowledge production to the creation of populations that can sustain the aspirations we have for our communities and the world at large.
Dr. Curry, I'm just mind blown. I mean, I knew this, but this has reinvigorated and reignited what I always talk about when I go into these spaces. I just didn't have that language. So I'm grateful to you today. Thank you for coming, and
Thank you for the invitation.
Really, this was just amazing. And we have to uplift the vision again of my sister, Zakiya Sankara-Jabar. Without her, this wouldn't have happened. I'm grateful to you. And we look forward to seeing y'all tomorrow, where we are going to highlight those organizations that are doing this work and doing it successfully to counter that narrative. Thank you all again for coming and staying with us.